This is Claudia Files with the Center for Atlantic Studies. But right now, I want to welcome Tim Powers. Thank you so much for joining us, Tim. It's a delight to have you here. Timothy Powers is the Assistant Professor of the Department of Classics at Rutgers University. His research interests include Greek lyric poetry and performance, Athenian drama, music and meter. He had a fellowship at the Center for Atlantic Studies in 2006 through 2007. His publications include The Culture of the Kitharôidia, Cyber Chorus, Pindar's Peladones, and The Aura of the Artificial. He has a variety of other articles and texts. We'll be happy to point everyone towards that, those details if they check out the website, the page on Hour 25. And if for whatever reason you're watching this at a later date, you can still follow up on those. I want to let everyone know that you can also read in its entirety at the CHS website for free Professor Powers' book, The Culture of the Kitharôidia, and that's really going to be our topic for today. We're going to be talking about sort of these rock star performers that I think tend to not get as much attention as some other performance genres. Hi, Tim. You're back.
Hi. Sorry, I'm back already.
Great. We can hear you, so it's so nice you did that. And I was just letting everybody know that they can read your entire book at the CHS website.
Wonderful. Yes, you can. Mm-hmm.
That we're going to be talking about sort of these rock stars of ancient Greek performance. And, you know, I think one of the things that's so beautiful about your book is the way that you point out that these figures and this tradition has not really gotten some of the attention that really deserves, right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, the you were all in can I call this Hour 25? Is that that's what I should be calling this? Yeah. I mean, you're all studying epic poetry of Homeric epic and lyric of poetry by poets like Sappho.
Yes.
And essentially, there was in the Archaic and the Classical and the Hellenistic and into the imperial period of Greece and Rome, a very popular, vigorously thriving genre called Kitharôidia, which is the song or the music of the Kithara. And you on the CHS site, you see a wonderful picture of Apollo as kind of the paradigmatic Kitharode, and that picture really captures the cultural prestige and the glamour of these performers who are also poets and composers who would, unlike, say, a Sappho or some of the other lyric poets, get up on stage in front of thousands of people playing their lyre, but it's really a big version of the lyre called a kithara, and entertain masses of people at major festivals all throughout the Greek and the Roman worlds, and often in competition with one another in so-called agones. It's not like we didn't know that this was a major performance genre for virtually all of antiquity. But really the problem is that very few of the texts that these Kitharodes performed have been preserved. Because it was a popular genre, it was really a part of pop culture to a great extent. So it didn't kind of track and get preserved, especially during the Hellenistic period, by the learned librarians at Alexandria and other places. Those figures just weren't really interested in what the Kitharodes were singing. And it was likely that, it wasn't the most elevated kind of poetry. It wasn't really the kind of, poetry to kind of grapple for a lifetime with, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. It was probably on a different order, but nonetheless very interesting. Now, having said that, we do have some fragments from Kitharodes, and that material had largely been understudied before I kind of undertook to look at it exclusively in my book. And I hope that what I've done is really shine light on again, something that scholars who were interested in Greek poetry and performance knew about for a long time, but really just kind of didn't confront directly. So it was the book was kind of one of those things where it was like, I'm just going to really sit down and try to figure out what was going on, at these festivals where you have these professional musicians playing for rabid audiences.
No, I love that idea, and I think it's great if you could talk us through it. And I know you're not feeling well, and I so appreciate
No,
it.
that's no, that's
Talk about rock stars. You were so wonderful.
It was my daughter has been
No.
sick, and I finally got it this morning. So yeah.
Yes, I know that.
But I'm feeling. I slept in, so I'm feeling good
Okay.
right now. I'm fine.
So I was hoping what you could do for us now is really talk about that spectacle. You know, what was it like? Let's imagine that we're in the audience, and this person comes out on stage. What do we see? What do we hear? Right?
Yes. Well, I do, and I don't. I mean, my book opens with, and I'll kind of walk through this scene.
Yeah,
I kind of open my book with a scene which is very kind of late in the history of this genre.
Right, tell us about it. Who's the person? Who's the person you have in mind here?
It's Emperor Nero, the Emperor Nero, who we all know fiddled while Rome burned, but he didn't in fact fiddle. There were no fiddles in Rome or in Greece at the time. But what he did do was play the Kitharôidia while Rome burned, or at least that's what they said. But that story may be apocryphal, but what isn't apocryphal is the fact that Nero idolized these Kitharôids. You know, they were like the rock stars. You know, they were the most glamorous and prestigious musicians. So, for Nero, who had these aspirations, and he had his hand, he was doing dabbling in all kinds of different arts, of course. But this one, and this is an argument that I make in the book. Kitharôidia for him really was the most important. It represented for him kind of the pinnacle of artistic achievement. So even though he was into acting and chariot racing and various other things, it was really Kitharôidia that he wanted to master. And so he studied with the best of the best. He employed the greatest Greek Kitharôids of the time. He brought them to Rome to train with to train with them, and he did things. We just had. There's a ton of sort of testimony about the seriousness with which he took this enterprise, and he supposedly would put a heavy lead plate on his chest so that he could master breath control. He would avoid, not have sex. That was a big thing for professional musicians. They thought that if sexual attention let them have better musical performances, and a whole range of other things. So he was really into it. I mean, he was really serious about this. And I opened the book with a scene sort of trying to evoke, and here, I'm being a little bit almost novelistic about it, because I'm working from sources which are fairly bare bones and just trying to color it in a little bit. But there are various accounts of Nero performing in the city of Naples, which was in Nero's day, so roughly the middle of the 1st century CE. A very Greek Hellenic city, and for the Romans, it was close by, but it was like almost kind of a Hellenic Disneyland. It was like that was it was a really Greek polis, and Greeks, Hellenophile Greeks would go there, just to sort of soak it in. And Nero was attracted to Naples for that reason, because he was a Hellenophile, and he knew that there were important musical contests and events there, and he went there to make a name for himself in this art. And so I sort of take a scene that's described. I kind of begin with this scene that a number of sources describe, because supposedly while he was playing his concert, an earthquake began in Naples, a pretty serious earthquake. And of course, all of the sources that are hostile to Nero are like, well, that's the gods. They're so angry with him. He's so hubristic, right? And his music's so horrible that it's a fitting kind of thing to happen. But more generally, I kind of use it just to evoke, yeah, exactly. What would an audience member kind of see? Not only with Nero, although I think it would have been really amazing with Nero, but any major league Kitharôid. And so you'd have audiences with a few thousand people, and it would be at some kind of larger religious and civic festival event. But very often at these festivals, be they in cities or in kind of pan-Hellenic shrines like Delphi, the Kitharôidia contest was like the big thing. That was the, you know, the most important event, at least on the cultural side of things at these festivals. You know, people would be excited to see the stars of the day. In this case, also Nero, which is a crazy, crazy thing, and I'm sure they were very curious what they were going to see. Is that better? I'm just trying to figure out the. Yeah. Okay. Good. Sorry about that. Oh, that is better. The Kitharôid would come out on stage, and a big thing with the Kitharôids was the costume and the outfit, and we have really lavish descriptions in our literary sources for the kinds of things that they wore. These long flowing robes often with like inlaid, work on them, they carried, of course, their kithara, their stringed instrument, which itself for these guys were like, these were incredibly expensive, finely wrought instruments, sometimes made of precious materials. And
can you describe that a little bit? Because some of our viewers may not be familiar with even what that is. What does it look like? What is it made out of?
So it's
how big is it?
It would be about. I'm trying to sort of. They could be quite big, or they could be a little smaller. They could certainly be, larger, considerably larger than the torso of the performer. So maybe 3 feet across and roughly as high, but sometimes even larger. We have vase paintings which show really big kitharae, and these instruments were so big because they really needed to project. I mean, so again, there were like thousands of people in the audience. They were up on a kind of platform, on a bema, in front of these crowds. And the instrument really needed to project. So it wasn't like, I'm sure you've all seen images in vase paintings of the tortoise shell lyre, which was like the amateur's instrument, which is kind of it's made, the sound box is made from a tortoise shell, and it's just kind of a simple kind of rounded line, and the strings are affixed to the bottom of the tortoise shell, that was like an upright piano or a simple beginner's guitar. But this instrument was of a totally different order. It was made by expert craftsmen. It didn't have a tortoiseshell sounding board. It just had a big resonant wooden soundboard beneath the strings. So the sound would really kind of bounce off and be well projected into the audience. I'm horrible at describing things, as you can see. I have a very limited. What I would do is I'm happy to share images with you, and if you do, you had a really splendid picture, I think, of Apollo with a kithara, and Apollo is the divine exemplar of the Kitharôid, and in some sense, every Kitharôid is imitating Apollo, including like Nero. That was a big thing for Nero too. He had this fixation with Apollo, and saw himself as a kind of second Apollo. So sort of what better way to become the god, and then to be a Kitharôid.
So it's really about, are you saying that's really about reenactment as opposed to just like impersonation?
Right. Yeah. I can even use these terms with all of you because you're familiar with them, and I think that this really is a case of reenactment. Of a complex sort. And I think that Kitharôids, and I'm going to leave Nero to the side here, but in general, these were guys that had big egos. So I don't think we should think that they were content to get on stage and be seen as Apollo, right? And face their own identities. No, they were Timotheus of Miletus and Phrynis of Mytilene, and we have some of the names of the big stars of the archaic and classical period. So they were very much themselves, and that's what the audience wanted. But at another level, they were also engaged in that very characteristic mode or process of reenactment, which I assume you've all studied. This is something that Greg not obviously has done. This is like in some way one of his great contributions to understanding the kind of I don't know what to call it, the kind of cognitive processes of early Greek poetry that performers, don't only sort of in a very kind of loose way take on a persona or imitate, but they really become some kind of prototypical version of a performer within that genre. You know, if it's in lyric poetry, if you're reperforming Sappho, in some way you're becoming Sappho when you do that. I think with the Kitharôids, there is some sense in which they are becoming Apollo, and all of the finery of their costume and all of the kind of stage business that they engage in is part of that. You know, it's like of a divine order. You know, they're really kind of laying it on so thick. There's also a prototypical figure of the Kitharôid who's a mortal. So if Apollo is the kind of divine exemplar of the Kitharôid, and he kind of stands as the divine source of the genre, a figure named Terpander, it would be the kind of mortal, the secondary mortal prototypical Kitharôid. And Terpander was perhaps a real person. I would prefer to think of him as more of a legendary figure who sort of embodied the genre itself. He kind of, his biography and his persona sort of had folded into it the very nature of the genre itself. His name, hero, maybe, right? Exactly, very much like a culture hero. And his name means, you know, he has one of those great speaking names, and it means, Terpander is like he who brings terpsis, which is a word that is particularly applied to musical and poetic pleasure and delight. So he who brings terpsis to men in general, to andres, to men. So, you know, that says it all, and it really sums up, like, you know, this was the hedonic, pleasure-packed musical genre par excellence. You know, it gave you more bang for the buck than virtually anything else. So in another level, I think Terpander was another figure that, at least in some contexts, a performing Kitharôid would evoke. You know, would kind of take on that persona. But I'm always a little bit cautious about that, because I don't want us to think that they completely subsumed their identities, because they were also stars and celebrities, and that was a whole other part of the package. But all of that was
they
kind
of, as stars, they had followings. There was some rivalry between them, and
for sure. Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, I mean, this was like, you know, they had rabid fans, and factions. Right, so this would have been another kind of, to just kind of evoke viscerally the moment of performance at a major festival. Exactly, you know, you would have had factions, you would have had supporters of one or the other performer, one of the other Kitharôids, and they would be, you know, agitating to have that Kitharôid voted as the victor of the contest, and boos and applause and other kinds of, you know, ways to register at high volume disapproval and approval. It was as crazy a scene as you could imagine, you know, at a rock concert or something like that, but with the element of competition thrown in usually, so that made it even more intense. Yeah.
So who would actually? How would the competition be decided? Do we know? Was
That's
that
a good? It's a very it's a
or?
wonderful question, and there's no. To my mind, there's no really definitive answer for this. Audience appeal must have played a very large role in it. We know, we have some good indication of that, because when we get to let's say the 4th century BCE, when we get a lot of kind of conservative figures like Plato and even Aristotle, who are not big fans of popular music culture, one of the things that they kind of mention explicitly or implicitly is that, you know, when these performers, and they're thinking of Kitharôids, but also other kinds of big-time musical performers, when they get on stage, they're playing for the audience. And why are they playing for the audience? Well, because they want to go over well, but they also want to win the contest if a contest is involved. So there are good indications that that's exactly how things were decided. And we even have a few anecdotes in which the decision goes against the majority view of the crowd, and riots ensue. I think there's 1 or 2 anecdotes that suggest that, and I would take those to be, you know, roughly have a kind of rough veracity to them, because people felt very passionate about this art, and they would expect that their favorites would carry the day. But having said that, I'm sure that in some contexts and in some city-states and in some festivals, judges were elites who may have made decisions apart from the crowd. So I think it probably varied, but for the most part, I think it was popular consensus that carried the day.
Hi.
You also talk about how this instrument is appealing to everyone, egalitarian instrument.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
I mean, that's striking to me. So it clearly, again, from taking the entirety of our sources for Kitharôidia together, the iconography, the literary sources, the epigraphy, it's very clear that it really does cross socioeconomic lines, class lines, that elites, aristocratic citizens of Greek cities were hugely enthusiastic for this art, as were, the common run of the demos in cities, and then in Rome it becomes quite popular in Rome, certainly by Nero's day. So that's one of the very striking things to me about it. There are certainly some, I mentioned Plato and Aristotle, we do get some elite, intellectual and socioeconomic elite writers who disdain Kitharôidia, just I think because of the way it appeals across class lines. But for the most part, I think this was something everyone could have fun with and enjoy and not feel kind of guilty about, or it wasn't a guilty pleasure or anything like that. I mean, all signs point to that, and I think that that's pretty remarkable. And I would say that that's a really signal difference between Kitharôidia and lyric poetry. And by that I think of Sappho and Alcaeus and Anacreon and some of the other figures you all might have been studying and talking about. They composed their music and poetry, much of it to the lyre, not necessarily the kithara, but to the smaller lyre, for performances in very small settings, typically made up of elites. So that really, nothing could be kind of more different from that type of lyric music. And then the Kitharôidia, which was also lyric music of a sort, but at a completely different order and with a completely different scope.
I mean, do you think that has something to do with the length of time that this was a very powerful tradition?
Yeah, I mean, that's also, to me, I mean, this was one of the most remarkable things about, coming out the other side of the book, was just the fact that it basically remains like the most popular performance genre from the archaic period of Greece to like the later Roman Empire.
That's crazy.
It's really crazy. It's remarkable. I mean, that of course there were innovations, there were changes. I mean, sometimes it's hard to know exactly what those were, unfortunately, but there must have been. And so it evolved and it changed to some extent, but essentially it was still one guy with his instrument on stage in front of a large crowd, singing for them. And it seemed never to have failed to just the charisma of the performers, their virtuosity. And I said before, we don't have many of the texts that they sang, but that must have been a big part of it too. And here I'll just say one of the things that we do know about it, about Kitharôidia, in terms of the text, is that they did sing some of the same material that we associate with Homer, so heroic narratives. And one of the things, if you make it further through my book, it's a slog. But if you make it a few more chapters in, I kind of sort of posit this genre, the Kitharôids, as sort of it's a medium that's kind of going in parallel with the Rhapsodes. So on the one side you have the Rhapsodes, who are obviously promulgating Homeric epic. They're singing the text that would become the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as other early hexameter poetry. And then you have the Kitharôids, and they're actually telling a lot of the same stories. In fact, I think it's totally reasonable to think that there was a kind of alternative Kitharodic version of the Iliad and the Odyssey and other songs of the epic cycle. And there was, of course, overlap between the two. But I also think that they were competitive with one another, not directly competitive, because they didn't perform at the same contests with one another, but in a more kind of broadly cultural way, that you had the Rhapsodes, who were really becoming identified with epic, and you had the Kitharôids, who were also as well, but increasingly, I think, being overshadowed by the Rhapsodes in that regard. And when you get to like the later 5th century, I think then you can see that the Kitharôids were looking for different kinds of material to perform, not the traditional Homeric epic stuff, let's call it, but different kinds of narratives. Because by then, like the Rhapsodes had a lock on Homer.
May I ask something?
Yes, of course.
You just mentioned, hello. Yeah, you're mentioning this rival Aeolic tradition of Kitharôic epic. Now,
Yeah.
in which sense do you think is it rival? In sense of performance, acceptance by the audience, or rival in terms of competence, creativity? Because
I think that's a great question, and it's good to kind of interrogate that word rivalry. And I probably didn't do that enough, and that's a very thoughtful question. I mean, I'm going to say maybe all of the things you just mentioned figure into this, you know, the possibility of a rivalry between these two, you know, craftsmen of song, the Rhapsodes and the Kitharôids. I think, you know, in some sense, the way I conceptualized this term of rivalry was, yeah, not so much that they were competing for audiences with one another, right? Like a professional rivalry per se. That is that, you know, they would starve if the Rhapsodes would starve if the Kitharôids became too prominent, the exponents of, you know, Trojan epic. Not so much like that, but more of a sort of prestige factor in which, you know, you had a kind of competition for who truly possessed the essence of the material, and that kind of, you know, who really owned Homer, who had the authoritative Homer, or who had the authoritative version of this or that epic tradition. And I think that's something that, you know, Greg has talked quite a bit about, but more in terms of early sort of rhapsodic traditions, the way that different groups of rhapsodes were kind of competing, along with tyrannical patrons like the Pisistratids and Polycrates of Samos, and Cleisthenes of Sicyon and other figures who were, you know, interested in associating or linking their polis with these traditions. And the Rhapsodes would have played a part in that to some extent, as well as the Kitharôids. But I think it was more of the sense of, you know, who has the most kind of direct access to the truth of the material, rather than a kind of more just practical style of professional rivalry.
To that, I might add, this is a problem of the one-man show of the Kitharôids, in contrast to the family of Rhapsodes.
Yes, that's a great
makes
point.
It more
yeah.
Difficult to. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. The one I would throw in one point in that regard, and that's a great point. There is some reason to believe that Kitharôids were organized maybe at an earlier point in the Archaic period into the early Classical period in these kinds of clan-like groups. In particular, the Kitharôids from the island of Lesbos, Sappho and Alcaeus' island, were reputed to be the most talented and virtuosic ones. Terpander was supposedly from Lesbos. So there might be some reason to think that there was a kind of clan-like organization of lesbian Kitharôids, but beyond that, it gets a little bit harder to say, and it's much easier in that regard to try to reconstruct these familial type groups of rhapsodes. Harder to do for Kitharôids, so that's a very good point.
Janet, please.
Bill, go ahead.
Hi. Bill Moulton, my interest is in Greek mythology in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So a while back, I was doing some research on the mountain gods, the few of them there are, and almost all their stories have to do with musical contests. And there's a bunch of other musical stuff I didn't understand, and now there's somebody that knows about the musical stuff I can ask.
Okay.
So there's a mountain outside Thebes, Citharon.
Yeah.
Is there any relation between the instrument and the mountain?
I don't think so. As far as I know, there isn't an etymological or linguistic link between them. I guess I've never really thought of it, but I don't think so. But I could get wrong. No, I don't think so.
Okay, and the other part of my research, which I totally didn't understand, was musical modes.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So instead of major and minor scales, which are the basis of most contemporary Western music, the Greeks for the most part used a collection of, they were kind of scales, but they weren't like our major and minor scales, which you could just play on a keyboard. You could play a C major scale or a D major scale, and they're the same. They have the same collection of intervals. It doesn't really matter where you start. The pitch is going to be different, but the structure of the scale will be the same. The modes are different. The Greek for modes is harmoniae, which just means tunings, and that refers to the prominence of the lyre in early Greek music. That is the way you would tune the lyre, the 7 strings of the lyre, to play a mode, right? So you could tune the instrument, get a certain collection of intervals, and that would be the mode you would use in which the composition you were playing was composed. So, a major scale has like a whole step, a half step, a whole step. With the modes, they're different. So you have a kind of a weird collection of intervals for each one, and no one mode is like any other one. And they were also, as you know, probably know, they were associated with certain regions and localities in Greece, like the Phrygian mode and the Lydian mode. What that indicates is that almost surely these modes were not just about the notes and the intervals in them, but they also kind of carried a whole ethical and kind of a whole series of associations with them, so that when you played, for instance, the Phrygian mode, it wasn't just that you were playing these certain notes at certain intervallic relationships with one another. There were certain kind of rhythmic things and tempo things and timbre things that were associated with that mode. So that's another sense in which the modes are very much unlike minor and major scales. The Kitharôides were virtuosi, obviously, and they could do any mode or modes. And we know that toward the end of the 5th century BCE into the 4th century, Kitharôides began to experiment with adding strings to their kitharai. So instead of 7 strings, which was the traditional number, and with 7 you could play all of the notes of the modes, because modes tended to have 7 notes. By adding 8th, 9th, 10th, even an 11th string, you could now begin to do modulations, play elements of one and another mode at the same time. I mean, the range was expanded. So, the Kitharôides were also very much at the forefront of musical innovation in general, and that's a very good example of it. They weren't content to just be stuck with one mode, because on a stringed instrument, if you wanted to change the mode, you had to retune it. You had to stop and retune the whole instrument to make the intervals different, to go from, say, Phrygian to Lydian mode. So with the addition of extra strings, that was one way to kind of work around that. So these guys were very kind of cutting edge and avant-garde as well.
That is so fascinating. No, so I'm not sure, Marie, do you have a question? Oh, you're muted, Maria.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello,
can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Timothy.
Hi.
I'm Maria Xanthou. I live in Bristol, UK. Is it possible to give us also some feedback, since you wrote on Pindar, and I assume you wrote about Epinician songs?
Yes. Would you like to give us some comment about the relation between Pindaric and Epinician poetry as a genre with Kythara and Yes,
Kitharôidia?
yeah, sure, I will. I could begin by saying I'm not sure if you're aware of a debate that took place, I guess, through the 80s and somewhat into the 90s about how exactly Pindaric eponychia were performed, right?
Yes.
And so you had a group of scholars who began to argue against the older consensus that they were choral, and they argued that it was just solo performers who sang, and many of them argued they sang to a kithara. So they were like looking to, sorry about that, they were looking to you know, Kitharôidia as a kind of like, oh, maybe we can explain these kind of inconsistencies we see about Pindar by saying like, oh, maybe Pindar himself was a Kitharôd and he just sang these eponychia. Well, I'm not in that group. I still am a fairly confirmed choralist when it comes to Pindar. I really strongly believe that the odes were performed by and large by a group of young men in a chorus. Trained either by Pindar or a proxy of Pindar, but nevertheless, I see scattered throughout the corpus of the eponychia interesting references and allusions to Kitharôidia as both a performance genre in the mythical past as well as in the contemporary present. So Pindar was engaging as he engages with all different kinds of performance media, including rhapsodes and lyric poetry and dithyramb, you know, so he mentions these other genres and he kind of treats them thematically in some way in the eponytions, and he does this with Kitharôidia too, but that doesn't mean, I think, that he performed them that way. I think that brings more problems with it than it solves. But for instance, the longest Pindaric eponytion, which is Pythian 4, which retells the Argonautic myth, the quest for the golden fleece. It's very, I can't think of how many lines it is offhand, but like what, almost 400 or over 400. You know, that poem was one that a lot of the scholars said, no, that it's very impossible to imagine a chorus singing that. So that's one that was very likely performed solo. Well, again, I'm not as deterred by the fact that it's long. I think choruses were capable of performing very long texts, and I do think that one was choral. But nevertheless, that is a poem that's filled with very interesting, I might call it kind of Kitharôtic, I don't know, themes in it, because of the prominence of Orpheus in the myth, because he accompanied the Argonautic expedition, one of these Kitharôtic themes that is, I think, a very common one for poets of all kinds to kind of invoke and play with is the way that Kitharôdes in myth, typically, and legend, were able to use their music to pacify, to bring order and discipline to communities and individuals and cities. So it was like Orpheus, obviously, we see that with. He could tame animals and beasts and trees. We see the myth of Amphion, for instance. With his Kithara, he brought the stones together to form the walls of Thebes. So there's a very rich and very ancient connection between the music of the lyre / Kithara and social order, political organization. You know, the idea of the kind of the harmony of lyric music being a metaphor for the concord of the polis is a very deeply felt one. So, you know, that's the kind of theme that we see from time to time Pindar evoking. You know, the power of the of lyric music and Kitharôtic music to bring peace and order and cooperation. To take one example. Yeah.
Maria, please.
If I may add, and to what Tim has already wonderfully expounded, let us be reminded of the name of the wife of Cadmus, the founder of Thebes.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is Harmonia,
yeah.
Which is harmony. So it probably is related in a way.
Yeah.
What Timothy has just explained. So I would like also to add you just to take us a bit further during the archaic ages. I must add that you know I started myself as a Pindarist,
okay.
So that's why I'm really interested in what you're saying. Is it possible, perhaps, since I'm totally with you when you mentioned that Pythian 4 is probably performed by a chorus. I belong also to these people who believed that there was a chorus performance and re-performance, of course.
Yeah.
Except from some occasions where you might say that certain performances took place in symposia or you know, in especially in Hieron or in Sicily, etc.
Yep.
I was wondering, could you also comment on the use of lyre in, if you would like to, on Stesichorus's lyric, long lyric? Because this is
Yeah.
also a related issue.
It, very much so, yes. Yeah, thanks. I mean, Icarus is another figure who has been the subject to some debate about the mode of performance. His name, of course, would suggest that he composed for choral performance. But again, the length of the texts, I mean, obviously we don't have the full extent of those, but we know they were quite long, has suggested to some that choruses couldn't do this, and it would be very likely. And then there's some ancient testimony that points towards solo performance to the Kithara. So I find, listen, I'm still a confirmed choralist when it comes to Icarus, and I think that there's good reason for that. But I do understand the other side too on this matter. And in my book, I take a very sort of I don't know, it's a kind of workaround on this issue that I don't think many would necessarily follow me in. But I think that there might be something to it, which is that I think it's possible that Icarus was influenced by Kitharôidia as a composer of choral music. And this is reflected in some of the testimonia about his relationship to Kitharôidia. So it's not that he was literally composing for solo performance to the Kithara like a real professional Kitharôd, and because there's no real reason to think he was. We get no testimony that has him at a contest in front of an, playing by him, by himself. There's nothing in his biographical tradition that suggests that, but he is linked consistently with the Kithara. And so without getting into too many details on this, I think that it's likely that he emulated certain musical as well as textual tendencies that the Kitharôds, archaic Kitharôds, had been developing, and brought that into choral music. So in particular, these long, extensive, heroic epic narratives, sung lyrically, not rhapsodically, not, but instead of keeping it in a solo mode, he extended it to a choral mode. That's the way. So there is a close relationship between Icarus and the Kitharôds, but it's not that he himself belonged to their number. That's the way I would explain it. But I know that there are many influential Hellenists who are really convinced that he was a Kitharôd. I just don't think he was.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. So, Tim, I do see that it's 12:03,
yes.
And I'm aware that people have other commitments.
I know.
So I just don't want to keep them. We so appreciate your coming to talk to us today.
Well, I
so
love it. And again, my apologies to everyone for keeping you waiting. That was just
no.
But I'm happy we did it, and it was good.
Yeah.
I think it was great. I really enjoyed talking to you.
It's so pleasant. So, we'd love to talk to you again.
Yes. Well, yes. Yeah, we could do more on Pindar or Icarus or anything else. We don't have to do more Kitharôds. I'd love talking about lyric poetry, more about Rhapsodes if you want to do that. I love Rhapsodes too. So yeah.
It's beautiful. So our community is very invested in understanding performance generally. So all of those would be amazing places for us to take our conversation. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us, our community members, the people who are watching this live, and also even the people who are watching this recorded. We really appreciate your participation. Thanks so much for your time, and look forward to future conversations.
Bye, all. See you.
Take great care.
It was fun.